I want to talk about the way that many Christian apologists talk about Islam. What I commonly see from many conservative evangelical apologists is their warning that Islam is this contradiction of Christianity, that while Christianity secures religious freedom and a free society, the rights of women, etc., rights of freedom of belief, that Islam is this oppressive dark force that is going to impose Sharia law upon everybody and conformity of belief and so on. And I really want to challenge that simple construct. Now, I do want to say this. I do think that there is an important difference between Christianity and Islam, in that Christianity, the origin of Christianity is the death of Jesus, who subjected himself to the violence of others and then rose again. And then Christianity expanded as a pacifistic force of people seeking to love their neighbor and eschewing or rejecting violence and the violent imposition on their neighbor in order to spread the movement of the religion. Islam, of course, is very different. It begins with Muhammad leading armies taking up arms and through military conquer expanding the religion. Christianity is not like that, at least not originally. So that is an important difference. And you could argue that this is in respects in the DNA of Christianity versus Islam. The one grew through pacifistic love of neighbor, and the other one grew through military arms and violence. Fair enough. However, beyond that, things get much muddier and more complex. And this is something that I don't think Christian apologists, the ones who are critiquing Islam in a very sweeping way, really appreciate. So here's a story, big picture on Christianity. Yes, in these early centuries, Christianity was a pacifistic movement. Then comes Emperor Constantine, and he has this conversion experience, and then he becomes an advocate for the Christian religion. He's part of the Edict of Toleration to give Christians toleration within the Roman Empire. And then in the Edict of Milan in 313, there's this great flowering of not just um, toleration, but this recognition of other religious belief systems and that they're not going to, you can't impose upon them. And Constantine was really influenced here by a Christian theologian named Lactantius, who was a big advocate for what we today would recognize as sort of the dawn of freedom of belief, that you cannot impose your beliefs on others. And this was a really for a few years in the early fourth century was this golden era of religious freedom within the Roman Empire. But by the middle of the fourth century, Nicene Christians and Arian Christians are attempting to oppress and eradicate one another from the empire. And once things consolidate under a Nicene interpretation of Christianity with Emperor Theodosius in the late fourth century, now the focus is on oppressing and eradicating paganism, the traditional Roman religions within the empire. And by that point, this is no longer the Christianity that was pacifistic. This is a Christianity that will impose its beliefs on others and will seek to destroy Roman statuary and altars and so on from their religion. That at that point becomes closer to today when a Christian will show, for example, videos of the Taliban destroying Buddhist iconography or something and say, well, this is what Islam is. It's this kind of religious intolerance of other views. Well, that very much harkens back to the way that Christians in the fourth and fifth centuries were beginning to destroy traditional Roman religion and seek forcibly, through the point of the sword, to eradicate it from the Roman Empire. And for the next millennium, this is very much what Christianity is like, more than a millennium. It's very has no interest in what we would today call, freedom of belief and the free society and the rights of all civilians equally and so on. It's not about that. And of course, the nadir of all of this is the Crusades, arguably. But even if you go forward a couple centuries into the 16th century, and look at how Christians were treating one another. And two different lenses that you can look through to get a sense for how Christians were treating one another in the 16th century was read through Fox's Book of Martyrs, which used to be on the bookshelf of every good Protestant, and look through Martyr's Mirror, which was a collection of martyrologies from the Anabaptist tradition. So Fox's Book of Martyrs gives multiple lurid accounts of how Catholics were persecuting Protestants. Martyr's Mirror does the same thing for how Catholics and Protestants were treating Anabaptists. And you see time and again the most egregious types of capital punishment being uh, exerted upon other religious foes who were fellow Christians. For example, it was very common to drown Anabaptists, and in this sort of cruel irony, well, if you want to be immersed, we'll immerse you for good in water. And then there was some of the accounts. I remember one account, I actually forget, I think this was in Martyr's Mirror, of a woman being hanged. It could have been in Fox's Book of Martyrs, but a woman being hanged who was pregnant, and she was hanged over a fire. And I'm just not going to say any more about that. But it was just unbelievably graphic. Now, these martyrologies, taken with a grain of salt as historical records, there is, I think, some embellishment, arguably here and there, because of their function as a martyrology. But they had a rhetorical function. But nonetheless, they do give you a clear sense of the overall religious intolerance and the horrors that went with that in 16th century Christianity. You want to think Islam today is brutal in the Middle East or in Afghanistan? I mean, go back to 16th century Europe, the time of Martin Luther and John Calvin and so on. I don't think there's any grounds for Christians to be triumphalistic. So when did things change? Well, they begin to change in the late 16th century, particularly into the 17th century after the 30 Years' War, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 seeks to, through just necessity, to try to get Christians to stop killing one another for religious reasons, but for complex social, geopolitical, and economic reasons. It's always complicated. It's not just religion that's spurring violence. Nonetheless, Christianity as a justifying narrative for violence was woven throughout these religious wars of the middle of the 1600s. And so culminating in 1648 in the Peace of Westphalia. And then from that point on, very gradually, this idea of religious freedom, toleration, the rights of people, the equal rights of all people, extending eventually to women and to slaves, and then to getting rid of slavery altogether, and so on, and women the right to vote, and all these other things, they gradually develop over the next few centuries as Christianity undergoes a kind of enlightenment and a move into the modern world. Now, the thing I want to say is that when it comes to Islam, the kind of Islam that one is experiencing or encountering in parts of the world like the Middle East or Afghanistan and so on, much of that has not yet gone through the same sort of social process of enlightenment that took Christianity centuries to experience. So to critique Islam today and to say, oh, Islam is just this intolerant, dangerous religion, and it can't change. That's just what it is. It's inherently dangerous. It inherently doesn't recognize the rights of people and so on, is to fail to recognize one could have said the same thing about Christianity in the 16th century. But Christianity did change radically. And there's nothing in principle that says Islam cannot change in a similar way. And I know Muslims today who have undergone that sort of change and process and their understanding. Um, some of them are my neighbors. I've worked with some of them professionally in the academy. These are people that, frankly, they're a lot more tolerant and inclusive than many of the Christian nationalists that I've met, both online and in person. So when Christian apologists then make these simple equations that Christianity is tolerant and inclusive, and guarantees democracy or capitalism or whatever, and Islam is this dangerous threat to all these things, I think that is just failing to recognize the massive complexity of both of these religions in their historical expressions and their ability to develop, change, and adapt in good ways and in bad ways. And to conclude, I think we just have to keep the golden rule at the center of all of this. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you would want others to treat your religion with nuance and complexity, recognizing the good and the bad and how it can change and develop and modify over time, then you should extend that same courtesy, the complexity, the nuance, the charity to other religions, including Christian apologists, when they talk about Islam.